Welcome to View from the North on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today we'll talk about Trump. Trump needs economics 101. Why Trump's tariff program will make the USA worse off. Our guest for the show is Dr. Ken Rogers, retired Canadian businessman. Welcome to the show, Ken.
Hello, Jay. That's a pretty broad subject, but in many regards, to an economist, the answer is pretty simple. As what will the success of the tariff policy be? Well, you have to start off with, when you say success, whether you mean you or I, or really, in my opinion, what are the objectives that Trump himself has? Can he succeed with his own objectives? Well, there are two funny objectives that are kind of not purely an economic, whether it'll be a success or not. And the first one is, I think that one of the major purposes, one of two main purposes of his tariff policy is to help finance the tax cuts to the very wealthy in the United States. Um, Essentially, if you have a 10% across the board tariff on everything the U.S. imports, then that would produce a significant revenue to the United States Treasury, and therefore would the U.S. in giving the very wealthy a tax cut that would finance a good part of it. It certainly can't finance very much of it, so that unless they have an awful lot bigger budget cuts than appear to be the case, they can't achieve that. But I don't think Trump really cares too much. If we're to look at his record from the last time, he said, the tax cuts will cause such phenomenal growth in the economy that there will be more government revenue, and that didn't happen, and I don't believe it'll happen this time. So that I think that the U.S. is in for significant budget deficits. But the second objective that I don't think is an economic one is I really think, and this is a fairly solid Canadian view, that to some degree the tariffs and a bunch of this other stuff that he's doing are simply diversions that enable him to take actions that I personally believe will end free elections and democracy in the United States, and it'll create a dictatorship, and it'll end the rule of law. And basically, it's eliminating the balance of power system that the U.S. established, where Congress, the courts, and the president were sort of each responsible for something. And Trump's activities seem to be focused on ending, anything other than him becoming a dictator, and that's it. Now, down to the economic aspects, as far as I can see, will the tariff policy in particular and the other actions done fix the trade deficit? That's one objective. That is, the U.S. imports about 14% of its GDP, and it exports about 10% of its GDP. It has a humongous deficit in trade with other countries. Well, a second objective, I would guess, is Trump's objective, is to move manufacturing back to the U.S. Now, I don't think these objectives are as important as paying for the tax cut for the rich or the diversionary thing. I think in a lot of ways these are secondary. So, he may not care if the objective can't be accomplished too well. A third economic objective would be that there's less inflation, or the level of inflation is fairly low, in line with the Federal Reserve's objective of having about 2% inflation, and that you would have similarly low or lower interest rates. For example, right now, the level of interest rates are much higher than, in my opinion, as an economist, they should be, solely because of what Trump is doing. Interest rates are considerably higher than they are in Canada, which is not usually the case. Now, another objective would be that one should be increasing the gross domestic product in the U.S. and the amount of GDP per capita, or the standard of living of each and everybody. And essentially, that's in line with that. Have the economy grow a whole bunch. Um, and then the last economic objective, not necessarily of least importance, is keep the U.S. dollar in good standing around the world, that it could remain the reserve currency and the currency most often used for world trade. And those tie into the fact that the U.S. has had for a long time a free ride, and that its world trade, or its international trade deficit, that is that 14% versus 10% that I referred to a few minutes ago. How do you finance that? And it's just because everybody else is willing to hold on to U.S. dollars because they're useful, or that they wish to invest those U.S. dollars in the United States. The United States can just run that deficit because that remains, or has been, the case in the past. So now, when we come down to the tariff policy, you have to make an assumption. Now, making any assumption about what Trump really is doing or what he really intends, is I'd like to say, I'm not so sure my assumptions will be correct, but what looks like the assumption is that Trump wishes to negotiate trade agreements with each and every country very separately from the negotiation with any other country, um, but but to have these universal tariffs. Well, in the past, the U.S. always negotiated one country at a time and was trying to get, most importantly, the freest access to the other country's economy that any other country in the world had. For example, nobody gets into Canada as cheaply as the U.S. does for anything that's being exported into Canada. And that was pretty well the case everywhere. That is, it was called like I use the term, a hub and spoke system, like a bicycle wheel. You've got a hub, and each spoke, the U.S. in the middle has a little spoke over to country A and another spoke to country B. And so the U.S. always was able to sell its product into any country in the world on better terms than almost anyone else. And then, as a generalization, the U.S. was a supporter of the World Trade Organization and the rules-based trading system that the world has had for quite a few years now. Well, what this tariff system that he's got has planning on is, if you have a 10% tariff against everybody in the world, um, and just sort of stop there. Like, you can say, well, of course, he's going to have some funny extra tariffs on his pet subjects like steel and aluminum or automobiles, which, if you have just bigger tariffs, it makes the same economic theory just worse. Say the United States is going to create, in effect, there's two systems happening in the world at the same time. If the U.S. has a 10% tariff universally on everything around, and vis-a-vis every country, and as we've seen so far, every major country has had counter tariffs that they, in their mind, think approximately equate to the US 10% tariff against their products. So you'd really have, for the United Kingdom, anything going into the United Kingdom from the United States would cost 10% more than it used to, and everything going from the United Kingdom to the US would cost the American 10% more than it used to. Now, at the same time, you're sitting with countries like Canada and Australia and China and Russia. They want to stay with the same World Trade Organization system that has, been around for the world, despite the fact that the U.S. had this special advantage in every country because of its size and the size of its market and the bilateral deals that he made. Well, the rest of the world has moved to essentially free trade. So what really would happen is and let's use wheat production from Kansas or some other state. I think Kansas produces as much wheat as any other state, but that wheat, the minute it hits the world market, it has to compete with wheat from Canada, from Argentina, from the Ukraine, um, and from Australia. So, or from Russia. Well, what happens is the wheat from all of those other countries would now cost 10% less. That is, if you're going to sell to the European Union, why would the European Union, like they would have put a tariff because the U.S. says it will not buy anything from the EU unless it's at a 10% higher price. Well, the EU's counter tariff, we don't want to buy your wheat unless we want a 10% tariff on your wheat. Well, of course, you're not going to be able to sell any wheat. That is anything that the U.S. is selling to the rest of the world is going to be a problem, because it has a price problem. And at the same time, everything the United States buys from the rest of the world is going to cost 10% more. For example, all of the farmers in the United States need potash. Well, the United States doesn't have any potash. They can get it from the satellite countries of Russia, Kazakhstan and I think Uzbekistan is the other one, but the only other country in the world, and with about a third or 40% of the potash the world has is Western Canada. And if he doesn't like Saskatchewan potash, well, then the farmers can't produce as much. Well, if he puts universal tariffs at 10% on everything, well, then the poor farmer has a 10% price increase on all of his fertilizer. And that means anything they produce costs everybody in the United States more, but makes anything the US exports more expensive and therefore less competitive. So when you really take the whole thing, it really doesn't make any sense at all economically. So you may say he's willing to do absolutely idiotic things in order to the great detriment of American business, farmers, industry, and the public, simply to give the rich people a tax cut. That's my cynical way to look at it, is I really don't believe his advisors are so stupid that they don't understand the simple basic economics that an across the board 10% tariff is very, very detrimental to the United States economy. Anyhow, that's kind of the key to all of that is U.S. imports will be way more. If the U.S. If a widget costs 10% more to be manufactured in the United States than to be manufactured in India, and I use the word widget just because it could be anything, and India just as if it's any country. Well, then Americans would buy from India um, the widget. If the widget from India costs just 6% more than it would cost in the US, well, then the 10% tariff, they'd still buy from India. But if the United States competitiveness or lack thereof, if it costs everybody else in the world, or let's say the US cost to produce a widget is 9% or less than 10% more than the best price elsewhere in the world, then you will have some manufacturing move to the US. So if you really think that closing down an automobile plant in Mexico and and hoping that it would move to the US instead, that would only happen if the economics are such that the the difference in that would cover the tariff 10%. Well, there's no way that the Mexican worker earns, uh, they earn way, way less than an American worker. If the difference was only 10%, then maybe you'd get the manufacturing economically in the US to make sense. But, Trump saying, well, maybe we need 25% tariff on autos to make it happen. But that certainly would mean every automobile in the United States that would otherwise be produced for less might be 25% more expensive. Well, therefore, the American would have less money to buy anything else, and therefore the gross national product would shrink. Just it's simple. 1+1 does not equal 3.
I've been in my mind listening to your thoughts about all these factors in play at the same time, and it's very worrisome. Let's look at Joe Dokes, okay? And Joe Dokes is Middle American. Maybe he's a Trumper, maybe not. He comes from the Midwest. He has not had a good economic life in the U.S. His family is making less money than it did. Jobs are hard to come by.
That's the area that Canadian oil goes to. So is gasoline's going up 10%?
Well, there's a bunch of factors in play, and yes, absolutely, the cost of gas goes up, and he has more trouble buying gas. But there's other things too. This whole notion of reshoring, and that's his term, reshoring American manufacturing that was lost overseas back to America, that's not working. There's been articles in the paper about how American industry is actually moving offshore. And one of the reasons is they want to get away from Trump because, what he's doing is extortionate. So, and they don't want to be part of his, his Trump wake up in the morning kind of policy. But there are so many other things, Ken. Number one is the tax reform isn't really going to help the people, my Joe Dokes people. They're not going to make any more money because of that. The disposable income is not going to improve at all. In fact, there is many factors that are going to undermine any improvement in their disposable income and probably make it worse. Let me identify a couple of them. Number one, as you said, gas, but also inflation in general. His tariff system is already creating inflation for them. They're not making enough additional money. They're not making any additional money so as to cover the cost of that inflation. So they can buy less. Okay. Secondly, the government services that he's providing to them, the social safety net, the food stamps, what have you. There's a million things that he's cut off. They're not going to have the benefit of all those things. Now, it could be that the states will have to step in, local government will have to step in and replace what the federal government is not providing. And I'll tell you, there are some things that are really huge. And that means they'll be charging more real estate tax and local income tax on Joe Dokes, and he will have still less money. He'd be paying more tax than before, not less. And then of course, you have the cost of these imported goods because of the tariffs, all the manufacturing. He won't be able to afford them. They're way more. And it's not only inflation; they're not available. And I think the supply line issues that Trump has created is going to make life very hard for anybody who needs a new refrigerator or what have you. So all of these factors play. And the other thing is, and this is really a major thing, is we have climate change. We have extreme weather. We have environmental degradation. And Trump doesn't believe in any of that. He doesn't believe in climate change, and he doesn't care about environmental degradation. So he's not going to do anything. And as a result, either these people have to live in a contaminated environment, water and food and what have you, or they're going to have to get local government to ante up, in which case that'll further increase the local taxes. So they're paying the same or more tax for less federal services, and they are expected to make up the difference. I just love that. Okay, then we get to FEMA. We get to the extreme weather. He's cutting off not only NOAA and the Weather Service, National Weather Bureau, and information about the next storm. He's cutting off the FEMA recovery money in case your neighborhood is inundated or destroyed. He's not going to give you any money. And what's happening, by the way, footnote to that, is that he controls what money FEMA, what's left of FEMA, spends on what neighborhood. So it's a political thing. And that means it's extortionate yet again. So what happens there is that when your house gets destroyed by a windstorm, a tornado, a rainstorm, and I love the fact that the press never associates these things with climate change, Trump will not help you. He's cutting FEMA off. So you're SOL. You don't have options, and your house is gone. Where do people go? What do? They don't have any money. They can't afford to buy anything. Oh, and they don't have jobs because all this reshoring business isn't happening. In fact, plants are shutting down, not building up. Investment is not increasing. It's shutting down. Foreign investment is not increasing. It's stopping. China is not buying our treasury paper. China is not investing in the U.S. the way it was, and so for Europe. So the result is these factories are not getting started up. They're getting undermined. So the poor stunk in Middle America and the Midwest, he's got it coming at him from 5 directions. He's never going to survive. Oh, let me add, by the way, health, and the availability of the government researchers, research to make health better, funding for health itself in general, to say nothing about education. The bottom line is that people will not have the health services available. Public health is declining now, and it will continue to decline. So after they don't have any money and they can't buy food, there's an article in today's paper about how people are actually financing food purchases, which is ridiculous. How long can you continue to do that? A couple of weeks, maybe? After that, no food? Gee whiz, it's going to get worse and worse. I don't know how anybody can defend his policies. And yet something over 40% still defend his policies. But the Joe Dokes guy is going to get killed. I mean, literally, his life is at stake with all these things happening. And one more point before I stop. Trump somehow engineered Nippon Steel's purchase of U.S. steel. Nippon was trying to buy U.S. steel for the past, 6 or 8 months or more. But now it's happening because Trump made it happen. So now, and I'm sure he has a hand in it because he has a hand in everything, whatever he does, including the tariffs by which he does extortion on people and countries. Now he immediately after that deal was announced, whether it concludes, whether it closes is not another question, but immediately after that deal was announced, he announced an increase in the amount of tariff on steel. So you can see there's a connection. He's not doing these tariffs for rational purposes. He's doing them either to manipulate, to threaten, to undermine the middle class, and to make some money, because I believe they're extortionate. When he goes and imposes a tariff on some sub-Saharan African country, and they tell the leader of the country, we'll reduce the tariff, but all you got to do is buy Elon Musk's Starlink system. That's corruption in the biggest, most blatant form you could imagine. So I think we have to connect all of this with the possibility that Trump is using these things not only for distraction and changing the subject and undermining our democracy, but taking money from the government, using the government as a way to develop his own income and wealth. So, God, what a picture. What a picture, Ken.
Well, the Canadian view of that, and tying back to my belief that, a very important underlying assumption that I make is that, a dominant motive of he and his buddies are that they want to end democracy as it end the rule of law in the United States, and that part of this corruption and graft like gangsters, that shows their real colors. I guess some of them just can't wait until they've got all their ducks in order to prevent getting booted out at the midterm election, if that is even feasible. He won't be out of the presidency, and his cabinet will still be there, and the court, his buddies in the Supreme Court seem to be backing him up, no matter how contrary it is to what the law was last week. Anyhow, most of what you say, I agree with fully. Fortunately, Canada's got new leadership, even though many of the cabinet ministers and so on are ones that were in the Trudeau government that did many wrong things. Now some of them get to show their real colors and are aiming in ways that are good for Canada, and certainly, I'm hearing every day of various Americans that would be extremely useful to the U.S. Or have been useful to the U.S. economy, are coming to Canada, and that's delightful. They will help us diversify from the madness that's going on in the U.S. Unfortunately, most of the sad things you say look like that's what you see from here. The way that the Trump people have cozied up with Saudi Arabia and the United Emirates, pardon my pronunciation. That's also a disturbing feature. It certainly, adds to the feeling that they're more interested in filling their pockets like a dictator would do, and maybe get your pockets fairly full just in case the full dictatorship can't quite be accomplished.
Well, there's really two large looming questions. One is Canada. What is Canada doing as a countermeasure? What is Canada doing in terms of expanding its geographical range on trade? what is Canada doing internally um, to make its economy more resistant? And I did notice that there was a news headline about Ontario, Saskatchewan, and your home province of Alberta, um, to suggest that the provinces were trying to remove trade barriers so that it's easier to trade between provinces, and that's notable. Can you describe what's happening?
That's correct, except your choice of provinces wasn't quite right. Or let's say I used to live in Alberta. I was born and raised there, but I don't live there now. However, all of the Canadian provinces, with the push from the Prime Minister Mark Carney, are trying to eliminate what are called all and anything that would make trade between provinces work less efficiently. That is, the and things that in the United States, as an example, are similar to Canada. If you have a law degree from the province of Alberta, you cannot, at a university there, you can't simply move to the province of British Columbia and start practicing law. Um, and that's similar to, as I understand, in the U.S. If you take your law degree in, which I understand or know very well that you did in New York City, that you had to go through some hoops before you could practice law in Hawaii. It's not impossible, but it certainly is an impediment to the most efficient way the economy can run, and that applies to all kinds of products. In Canada, we used to have a freight rate agreements that were set on the based on who had the most votes in Canada could dictate such a stupid policy, but you could ship something from, if it was a manufactured good, you could ship it from Toronto or Montreal west to, say, Calgary or Vancouver. Those are in the western side of Canada, for less money than if you made the same product in Calgary or Vancouver and wanted to ship it east to Montreal or Vancouver or Toronto. And the reverse was true with regard to raw materials. If you had your wheat, you could ship the wheat from Alberta, Saskatchewan in the west towards Ontario or Quebec for less money than if you grew the wheat in Quebec and wanted to ship it out west to Saskatchewan or Alberta. Um, and that type of economic policy law, or the legal basis for that type of stupidity occurring, that is now being broken down, and the barriers that would have nice free flowing trade. It's one of the major moves in Canada because it was determined by a few fairly sophisticated economic analysis that eliminating the internal barriers to efficient trade would be almost as great as the elimination of the trading with the United States.
Yeah, that's great. That's really smart. That's great. It's good to hear. It's probably a permanent change. That's what it sounds like to me. The other thing for us to check up on is, when you and I spoke, we said that originally we said that Canada was oriented toward a north-south kind of trade, but it was changing its way of thinking to an east-west type of trade, and that means to Asia. It means to Europe. How is that doing, Ken?
Really well. For example, uh, you know, a part of Canada is, um, let's say, totally surrounded by Canada is a large bay of water, about roughly the size of the Gulf of Mexico, called Hudson's Bay. Now, Hudson's Bay, um, there's a railroad that runs north to Hudson's Bay to a deep water port. Some Americans may be familiar with that port. It's called Churchill because it's the world's best place to see a polar bear. In fact, it's inundated with polar bears at a certain time of the year. Well, that deep water port, um, you know, could move, let's say, Alberta oil or gas to Europe, um, where it would be a couple days less traveling time than going, even if you could ship it through the Great Lakes. Like you'd have to use smaller boats and so on, and change it a couple times to get something east. If you had a major pipeline, that's fine, but you could put one in there. So there was in the news, what's the likelihood of improving the transportation to that port, perhaps having, natural gas with an LNG plant at the other end, or several LNG plants, or oil. And if you had enough there, then you could deal with one of the problems of using that port is that Hudson's Bay, and the reason the polar bears go to that particular area at a certain time of year is because there's ice on Hudson's or on the Hudson's Bay at that time or in the winter time, and a good icebreaker can perhaps keep the port open more months than might otherwise be the case, and might spoil the polar bear reason for being there. That is, they go to that location on the basis that there will be ice in Hudson's Bay, because when there is ice, they have a lot easier time catching seals. If it's just open water, they can't do it as easily. You need icebergs and such things. Um, anyhow, you have similar objectives to go through all of the mountain ranges from Alberta, where there is oil and gas, to the Pacific coast, where the Asian market is much larger and would be more attractive for Canadian oil and gas. Since Europe is so close to the Middle East and pipelines from Russia than it is from, once you've got to ship your oil and gas from Canada, whether it's from the U.S. Gulf Coast for Americans reselling Canadian oil or otherwise. But uh, there is an awful lot of action going on in Canada right now that would not have happened had it not been Trump basically taking action that has required that Canada orient as much of its economic activity away from the United States as it can.
And so that leads to the question of how well is Canada's economy doing? And I would say, by the way, from just looking at the newspaper, that his whole thing about the 51st state has fallen off the side. It's a forgotten issue. And I think nobody is going to give it 2 cents of credibility anymore if they ever did. But he's hurting the economy, isn't it? And I suppose that has to be a regular news article coverage in the Canadian media about how Trump's tariffs are affecting the Canadian economy. Certainly, these countermeasures help to deflect that. But how is the economy doing?
I'm very surprised that the effect of Trump's um, messy policies has not so far damaged most of the Canadian economy. Now, it's important to realize that even Trump announces these tariffs and then he backs off. and he announces some more and he backs off them. Well, most of the goods from Canada are still going into the United States without tariffs. You have the industries that he has really made a mess of or really damaged Canada, uh, steel, aluminum, and automobiles. Now, parts of Canada where, let's say, where I live in British Columbia or anything in the West, anything west of Chicago, in the Canada side, is doing just as well as they were a year ago or 2 years ago. The automobile industry in Canada, autos and parts are all centered immediately north of Michigan and Ohio. They're in the province of a southern part of Ontario and Quebec. If you went from Quebec City to Detroit, you've got the whole Canadian part of that industry. And you similarly have steel is in the majority of it is in exactly the same area, and the aluminum is spread around a little bit more, but the biggest majority of it is in Quebec. So the three areas where Trump's policies are huge and damage exists. It's all focused in Quebec and Ontario. Now that as a Westerner, right from Western Canada, I say thank goodness because those two provinces dominate in population such that they control whatever the federal government is going to do. Well, if they're hurting, there's going to be federal government policies. If somebody's saying, well, they want to have a tariff for this or that, and what can Canada do as a whole suddenly becomes more important. But the Canadian economy actually increased about 2% in the first quarter, so that we do not have a recession yet. One is expected, but I'm very surprised, with the economic training I have, that the outlook for Canada is still pretty good. That is, we'll probably have a recession before the end of the year, in early next year, but nobody now is expecting it to be that dramatic. Certainly, it'll be just a short-term recession. Part of the actions that the Carney government is taking, and as we speak, they're coordinating meetings with all of the provincial premiers to accelerate as many major projects as they can. For example, I mentioned that port of Churchill. Well, the province of Manitoba, where that is located, has said we have this railroad. One of the things we think would be to really upgrade the capability of that northern railroad because this port can be useful. That type of thing can be done right away, even though you may not have an export terminal sitting there to export something. But if you're spending money to build the railroad, the economy survives despite the stupid policies imposed by Trump that hurt very much the Eastern Canadian market. And so they have each of the premiers of each of the 10 big Canadian provinces and the 3 territories. The territories are humongous in size, like the Yukon Northwest Territories and Inuit. They're huge in area, but very skinny in population. So, there's not too many projects that they would have that would help a lot of people, but you could have some great ones for spending a lot of money. Like there's an awful lot of really nice minerals in in say the Northwest Territories, but whether that makes the cut list. But Canada's creating these mega size projects as well as medium and small ones to give the economy a major push. Um, well, trade is being reoriented. At today, you may say there's fantastic um, aluminum refining facilities or factories in Canada. Now aluminum is pretty unique in where you can, convert bauxite to aluminum. You need an awful lot of power. Well, it'll be a long time before the United States can do its own aluminum refining in any scale. Because you've got to create, let's use, say, nuclear power. Well, you might need, 3 or 4 good nuclear power plants to provide the creation of one good aluminum plant. It's Trump can say all he wants about, he'd like to have, all steel and aluminum that the United States uses produced in the United States, but it would take a lot of years to get there. Well, what do you do in the meantime? You see, like the meantime disruption in the U.S. is really going to be quite meaningful, because if you have a 25% tariff on aluminum, and it takes 10 years to get, so the U.S. could have, facilities, if ever, to produce the aluminum themselves. Well, that's a 25% increase on everything that aluminum's used for.
We're out of time. We got to go now. Sorry, there's so much more to discuss, and we'll cover this, because not only are there things happening now that we haven't covered, but there will be new things happening. This is all a moving target, a dynamic picture, and there'll be more to cover. I'm so happy that you're available to help us understand what's going on in Canada and implications of Trump's machinations. Thanks so much to our guest, Ken Rogers, Dr. Ken Rogers, retired Canadian businessman. I'm Jay Fidell, host of View from the North, and we've been engaging on Trump Needs Economics 101, and indeed he does. Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again for the next one. Aloha. Aloha, Ken.
Goodbye from Canada, and welcome to Canada for those Americans with great talent that are coming here.